Part 2. Welcome to Voice of Pages, where timeless stories live again through sound. Tonight we begin the adventures of Ferdinand Count Fathom, complete by T. Smollett, a classic work from the public domain. Settle in, relax, and let the pages speak. For this pilgrimage, the unfortunate youth resolved nightly to perform during the whole time of his residence in England. It was indeed a sort of pleasure, the prospect of which enabled him to bear the toil of living through the day, though his patience was almost quite exhausted before the hour of assignation arrived. When the doctor appeared with the coach, he leaped into it with great eagerness, after he had with much difficulty prevailed with Don Diego to stay at home, on account of his health, which was not yet perfectly established. The Castilian, however, would not comply with his request until he had obtained the Count's promise that he should be permitted to accompany him next night and take that duty alternately with the physician. About midnight they reached the place where they found the sexton in waiting according to the orders he had received. The door was opened, the mourner conducted to the tomb, and left, as before, to the gloom of his own meditations. Again he laid himself on the cold ground. Again he renewed his lamentable strain. His imagination began to be heated into an ecstasy of enthusiasm, during which he again fervently invoked the spirit of his deceased Monimia. In the midst of these invocations, his ear was suddenly invaded with the sound of some few solemn notes issuing from the organ, which seemed to feel the impulse of an invisible hand. At this awful salutation, Melville was roused to the keenest sense of surprise and attention. Reason shrunk before the thronging ideas of his fancy, which represented this music as the prelude to something strange and supernatural. And while he waited for Tehee's sequel, the place was suddenly illuminated, and each surrounding object brought under the cognizance of his eye. What passed within his mind on this occasion is not easy to be described. All his faculties were swallowed up by those of seeing and hearing. He had mechanically raised himself upon one knee with his body advancing forwards, and in this attitude he gazed with a look through which his soul seemed eager to escape. To his view, thus strained upon vacant space, in a few minutes appeared the figure of a woman arrayed in white, with a veil that covered her face and flowed down upon her back and shoulders. The Phantom approached him with an easy step, and lifting up her veil, discovered, believe it, O reader, the individual countenance of Monimia. At sight of these well-known features, seemingly improved with new celestial graces, the youth became a statue expressing amazement, love, and awful adoration. He saw the apparition smile with meek benevolence, divine compassion, warm and entendered by at fond pure flame which death could not extinguish. He heard the voice of his Monimia call Rinaldo. Thrice he essayed to answer, as oft his tongue denied its office. His hair stood upright, and a cold vapor seemed to thrill through every nerve. This was not fear, but the infirmity of human nature oppressed by the presence of a superior being. At length his agony was overcome. He recollected all his resolution, and in a strain of awestruck rapture thus addressed the heavenly visitant. Hast thou then heard, pure spirit, the wailings of my grief? Hast thou descended from the realms of bliss in pity to my woe? And art thou come to speak the words of peace to my desponding soul? To bid the wretched smile, to lift the load of misery and care from the afflicted breast? To fill thy lover's heart with joy and pleasing hope was still the darling task of my Monimia, ere yet refined to that perfection which mortality can never attain. No wonder then, blessed shade, that now when reunited to thy native heaven, thou art still kind, propitious, and beneficent to us, who grown in this inhospitable vale of sorrow thou hast left. Tell me, tell me, dost thou still remember those fond hours we passed together? Doth that enlightened bosom feel a pang of soft regret when thou recallest our fatal separation? Sure that meekened glance bespeaks thy sympathy. Ah, how that tender look o'erpours me, sacred heaven! The pearly drops of pity trickle down thy cheeks. Such are the tears that angels shed o'er man's distress. Turn not away, thou beckonest me to follow. Yes, I will follow thee, ethereal spirit, as far as Tehee's weak limbs, encumbered with mortality, will bear my weight, and would to heaven I could with ease put off these vile corporeal shackles and attend thy flight. So saying, he started from the ground, and in a transport of eager expectation at awful distance traced the footsteps of the apparition, which entering a detached apartment sunk down upon a chair and with a sigh exclaimed, "Indeed, this is too much." What was the disorder of Rinaldo's mind when he perceived this phenomenon? Before reflection could perform its office, moved by a sudden impulse, he sprung forwards, crying, "If it be death to touch thee, let me die." And caught in his arms not the shadow but the warm substance of the all-accomplished Monimia. Mysterious powers of Providence! This is no phantom, this is no shade, this is the life, the panting bosom of her whom I have so long, so bitterly deplored. I fold her in my arms, I press her glowing breast to mine. I see her blush with virtuous pleasure and ingenuous love. She smiles upon me with enchanting tenderness. Oh, let me gaze on that transcendent beauty which, the more I view it, ravishes the more. These charms are too intense, I sicken while I gaze. Merciful heaven, is not this a mere illusion of the brain? Was she not fled forever? Had not the cold hand of Death divorced her from my hope, this must be some flattering vision of my distempered fancy, perhaps some soothing dream, if such it be, grant, O ye heavenly powers, that I may never wake. O gentle youth. Replied the beauteous orphan, still clasped in his embrace, what joy now fills the bosom of Monimia at this triumph of thy virtue and thy love? When I see these transports of thy affection, when I find thee restored to that place in my esteem and admiration, which thou hadst lost by the arts of calumny and malice, this is a meeting which my most sanguine hopes durst not presage. So entirely were the faculties of Rinaldo engrossed in the contemplation of his restored Monimia, that he saw not the rest of the company, who wept with transport over this affecting scene. He was therefore amazed at the interposition of Madame Clement, who, while the shower of sympathetic pleasure bedewed her cheeks, congratulated the lovers upon this happy event, crying, "These are the joys which virtue calls her own." They also received the compliments of a reverend clergyman, who told Monimia she had aped at last the fruits of that pious resignation to the will of heaven, which she had so devoutly practiced during the term of her affliction. And lastly, they were accosted by the physician, who was not quite so hackneyed in the ways of death, or so Alice to the finer sensations of the soul, but that he blubbered plentifully, while he petitioned heaven in behalf of such an accomplished and deserving pair. Monimia, taking Madame Clement by the hand, "Whatever joy," said she, "Rinaldo derives from this occasion, is owing to the bounty, the compassion, and maternal care of this incomparable lady, together with the kind admonitions and humanity of those two worth-while gentlemen." Melville, whose passions were still in agitation, and whose mind could not yet digest the incidents that occurred, embraced them all by turns, but like the faithful needle which, though shaken for an instant from its poise, immediately regains its true direction and points invariably to the pole, he soon returned to his Monimia. Again he held her in his arms, again he drank enchantment from her eyes, and thus poured forth the effusions of his soul. Can I then trust the evidence of sense? And art thou real lie to my wish restored? Never, oh never did thy beauty shine with such bewitching grace as that which now confounds and captivates my view. Sure there is something more than mortal in thy looks. Where hast thou lived, where borrowed this perfection, whence art thou now descended? Oh, I am all amazement, joy, and fear. Thou wilt not leave me, no, we must not part again, by this warm kiss, 1,000 times more sweet than all the fragrance of the East. We nevermore will part. Oh, this is rapture, ecstasy, and what no language can explain. In the midst of these ejaculations, he ravished a banquet from her glowing lips, that kindled in his heart a flame which rushed through every vein and glided to his marrow. This was a privilege he had never claimed before, and now permitted as a recompense for all the penance he had suffered. Nevertheless, the cheeks of Monimia, who was altogether unaccustomed to such familiarities, underwent a total suffusion, and Madame Clement discreetly relieved her from the anxiety of her situation, by interfering in tea discourse and rallying the Count upon his endeavors to monopolize such a branch of happiness. "Oh, my dear lady," replied Rinaldo, who by this time had in some measure recovered his recollection, "forgive the wild transports of a fond lover who hath so unexpectedly retrieved the jewel of his soul. Yet far from wishing to hoard up his treasure, he means to communicate and diffuse his happiness to all his friends. O my Monimia, how will the pleasure of this hour be propagated? As yet thou knowest not all the bliss that is reserved for thy enjoyment. Meanwhile, I long to learn by what contrivance thy happy interview hath been effected. Still am I ignorant how I was transported into this apartment, from the lonely vault in which I mourned over my supposed misfortune." Chapter 64, The Mystery unfolded another recognition, which, it is to be hoped, the reader could not foresee. The French lady then explained the whole mystery of Monimia's death. As a stratagem she had concerted with the clergyman and doctor, in order to defeat the pernicious designs of Fathom, who seemed determined to support his false pretensions by dint of perjury and fraud, which they would have found it very difficult to elude. She observed that the physician had actually despaired of Monimia's life, and it was not till after she herself was made acquainted with the prognostic that she wrote the letter to Rinaldo, which she committed to the care of Madame Clement with an earnest entreaty that it should not be sent till after her decease. But that lady, believing the Count had been certainly abused by his treacherous confidant, dispatched the billet without knowledge of Monimia, whose health was restored by the indefatigable care of the physician and the sage exhortations of the clergyman, by which she was reconciled to life. In a word, the villainy of Fathom had inspired her with some faint hope that Rinaldo might still be innocent, and that notion contributed not a little to her cure. The letter having so effectually answered their warmest hopes, in bringing back Rinaldo such a pattern of constancy and love, the confederates, in consequence of his enthusiastic sorrow, had planned this meeting as the most interesting way of restoring virtuous lovers to the arms of each other. for which purpose the good clergyman had pitched upon his own church, and indulged them with the use of the vestry, in which they now were presented with a small but elegant collation. Melville heard this succinct detail with equal joy and admiration. He poured forth the dictates of his gratitude to the preservers of his happiness. "This church," said he, "shall henceforth possess a double share of my veneration. This holy man will, I hope, finish the charitable work he has begun by tying those bands of our happiness, which naught but death shall have power to unbind." Then turning to that object which was the star of his Egard, "Do I not overrate," said he, "my interest with the fair Monimia?" She made no verbal reply, but answered by an emphatic glance more eloquent than all the power of rhetoric and speech. This language, which is universal in the world of love, he perfectly well understood, and in token of that faculty sealed the assent which he had smiled with a kiss imprinted on her polished forehead. In order to dissipate these interesting ideas, which by being too long indulged might have endangered his reason, Madame Clement entreated him to entertain the company with a detail of what had happened to him in his last journey to the Empire, and Monimia expressed a desire of knowing in particular the issue of his contest with Count Trebasi, who she knew had usurped the succession of his father. Thus solicited, he could not refuse to gratify their curiosity and concern. He explained his obligations to the benevolent Jew, related the steps he had taken at Vienna for the recovery of his inheritance, informed them of his happy rencontre with his father-in-law, of his sister's deliverance and marriage, of the danger into which his life had been precipitated by the news of Monimia's death, and lastly of his adventure with the banditti in favor of a gentleman who he afterwards understood had been robbed in the most base and barbarous manner by Fathom. He likewise, to the astonishment of all present, and of his mistress in particular, communicated some circumstances, which shall appear in due season. Monimia's tender frame being quite fatigued with the scene she had acted, and her mind overwhelmed with the prosperous tidings she had heard, after having joined the congratulations of the company on the good fortune of her Rinaldo, begged leave to retire, that she might by repose recruit her exhausted spirits. And the night being pretty far spent, she was conducted by her lover to Madame Clement's coach, that stood in waiting, in which also the rest of the company made shift to embark, and were carried to the house of that good lady, where after they were invited to dine, and Melville entreated to bring Don Diego and the Jew along with them, they took leave of one another, and retired to their respective lodgings in a transport of joy and satisfaction. As for Rinaldo, his rapture was still mixed with apprehension, that all he had seen and heard was no more than an unsubstantial vision, raised by some gay delirium of a disordered imagination. While his breast underwent those violent though blissful emotions of joy and admiration, his friend the Castilian spent the night in ruminating over his own calamities, and in a serious and severe review of his own conduct. He compared his own behavior with that of the young Hungarian, and found himself so light in the scale, that he smote his breast with violence, exclaiming in an agony of remorse, "Count Melville has reason to grieve, Don Diego to despair. His misfortunes flow from the villainy of mankind, mine are the fruit of my own madness. He laments the loss of a mistress, who fell a sacrifice to the perfidious arts of a crafty traitor. She was beautiful, virtuous, accomplished, and affectionate. He was fraught with sensibility and love. Doubtless his heart must have deeply suffered. His behavior denotes the keenness of his woe. His eyes are ever-flowing fountains of tears, his bosom the habitation of sighs. 500 leagues hath he measured in a pilgrimage to her tomb. Nightly he visits the dreary vault where she now lies at rest. Her solitary grave is his couch. He converses with darkness and the dead until each lonely aisle re-echoes his distress. What would be his penance had he my cause? Were he conscious of having murdered a beloved wife and darling daughter? Ah wretch, ah cruel homicide, what had those dear victims done to merit such a fate? Were they not ever gentle and obedient, ever aiming to give thee satisfaction and delight? Say that Seraphina was enamored of a peasant, say that she had degenerated from the honor of her race. The inclinations are involuntary, perhaps that stranger was her equal in pedigree and worth. Had they been fairly questioned, they might have justified, at least excused, that conduct which appeared so criminal, or had they owned the offense and supplicated pardon, O barbarous monster that I am. Was all the husband, was all the father extinguished in my heart? How shall my own errors be forgiven, if I refuse to pardon the frailties of my own blood of those who are most dear to my affection? Yet nature pleaded strongly in their behalf. My heart was bursting while I dismissed them to the shades of death. I was maddened with revenge. I was guided by that savage principle which falsely we call honor. Accursed phantom, that assumes the specious title and misleads our wretched nation. Is it then honorable to skulk like an assassin and plunge the secret dagger in the heart of some unhappy man who hath incurred my groundless jealousy or suspicion, without indulging him with that opportunity which the worst criminal enjoys? Or is it honorable to poison two defenseless women, a tender wife and amiable daughter whom even a frown would almost have destroyed? Oh, this is cowardice, brutality, hell-born fury and revenge. Heaven hath not mercy to forgive such execrable guilt. Who gave thee power, abandoned ruffian, over the lives of those whom God hath stationed as thy fellows of probation, over those whom he had sent to comfort and assist thee, to sweeten all thy cares and smooth the rough, uneven paths of life. I am doomed to never-ceasing horror and remorse. If misery can atone for such enormous guilt, I have felt it in the extreme. Like an undying vulture it preys upon my heart, to sorrow I am wedded, I hug that teeming consort to my soul, never, ah, never shall we part, for soon as my fame shall shine unclouded by the charge of treason that now hangs over it, I will devote myself to penitence and woe. A cold, damp pavement shall be my bed, my raiment all be sackcloth, the fields shall furnish herbage for my food, the stream shall quench my thirst, the minutes shall be numbered by my groans, the night be privy to my strains of sorrow, till heaven, in pity to my sufferings, release me from the penance I endure. Perhaps the saints whom I have murdered will intercede for my remission. Such was the exercise of grief in which the hapless Castilian consumed the night. He had not yet consigned himself to rest, when Rinaldo, entering his chamber, displayed such a gleam of wildness and rapture on his countenance as overwhelmed him with amazement, for till that moment he had never seen his visage unobscured with woe. "Pardon this abrupt intrusion, my friend," cried Melville. "I could no longer withhold from your participation the great, the unexpected turn which hath this night dispelled all my sorrows and restored me to the fruition of ineffable joy. Monimia lives. The fair, the tender, the virtuous Monimia lives and smiles upon my vows. This night I retrieved her from the grave. I held her in these arms, I pressed her warm, delicious lips to mine. Oh, I am giddy with intolerable pleasure." Don Diego was confounded at this declaration, which he considered as the effects of a disordered brain. He never doubted that Rinaldo's grief had at length overpowered his reason, and that his words were the effects of mere frenzy. While he mused on this melancholy subject, the Count composed his features, and in a succinct and well-connected detail explained the whole mystery of his happiness, to the inexpressible astonishment of the Spaniard, who shed tears of satisfaction and straining the Hungarian to his breast. "O my son," said he, "you see what recompense heaven hath in store for those who pursue the paths of real virtue. Those paths from which I myself have been fatally misled by a faithless vapor, which hath seduced my steps, and left me darkling in the abyss of wretchedness. Such as you describe this happy fair was once my Seraphina, rich in every grace of mind and body which nature could bestow. Had it pleased heaven to bless her with a lover like Rinaldo, but no more the irrevocable shaft is fled. I will not taint your enjoyment with my unavailing sighs." Melville assured this disconsolate father that no pleasure, no avocation should ever so entirely engross his mind, but that he should still find an hour for sympathy and friendship. He communicated the invitation of Madame Clement and insisted upon his compliance that he might have an opportunity of seeing and approving the object of his passion. "I can refuse nothing to the request of Count de Melville," replied the Spaniard, "and it were ungrateful in me to decline the honor you propose. I own myself inflamed with a desire of beholding a young lady, whose perfections I have seen reflected in your sorrow. My curiosity is, moreover, interested on account of that humane gentlewoman, whose uncommon generosity sheltered such virtue in distress. But my dispositio N is infectious, and will, I am afraid, hang like a damp upon the general festivity of your friends." Melville would take no denial, and having obtained his consent, repaired to the house of Joshua, whose countenance seemed to unbend gradually into a total expression of joy and surprise, as he learned the circumstances of this amazing event. He faithfully promised to attend the Count at the appointed hour, and in the meantime earnestly exhorted him to take some repose in order to quiet the agitation of his spirits, which must have been violently hurried on this occasion. The advice was salutary, and Rinaldo resolved to follow it. He returned to his lodgings and laid himself down, but notwithstanding the fatigue he had undergone, sleep refused to visit his eyelids, all his faculties being kept in motion by the ideas that crowded so fast upon his imagination. Nevertheless, though H's mind continued in agitation, his body was refreshed, and he arose in the forenoon with more serenity and vigor than he had enjoyed for many months. Every moment his heart throbbed with new rapture, when he found himself on the brink of possessing all his soul held dear and amiable. He put on his gayest looks and apparel, insisted upon the Castilians doing the same honor to the occasion, and the alteration of dress produced such an advantageous change in the appearance of Don Diego, that when Joshua arrived at the appointed hour he could scarce recognize his features, and complimented him very politely on the improvement of his looks. True it is, the Spaniard was a personage of a very prepossessing mien and noble deportment, and had not grief, by increasing his native gravity, in some measure discomposed the symmetry of his countenance, he would have passed for a man of a very amiable and engaging physiognomy. They set out in the Jew's coach for the house of Madame Clement, and were ushered into an apartment where they found the clergyman and physician with that lady, to whom Don Diego and the Hebrew were by Melville introduced. Before they had seated themselves, Rinaldo inquired about the health of Monimia, and was directed to the next room by Madame Clement, who permitted him to go thither and conduct her to the company. He was not slow of availing himself of this permission. He disappeared in an instant, and during his short absence Don Diego was strangely disturbed. The blood flushed and forsook his cheeks by turns. A cold vapor seemed to shiver through his nerves, and at his breast he felt uncommon palpitation. Madame Clement observed his discomposure and kindly inquired into the cause. When he replied, "I have such an interest in what concerns the Count de Melville, and my imagination is so much prepossessed with the perfections of Monimia, that I am, as it were, agonized with expectation. Yet never did my curiosity before raise such tumults as those that now agitate my bosom." He had scarce pronounced these words, when the door, reopening, Rinaldo led in this mirror of elegance and beauty, at sight of whom the Israelite's countenance was distorted into a stare of admiration. But if such was the astonishment of Joshua, what were the emotions of the Castilian when, in the beauteous orphan, he beheld the individual features of his long-lost Seraphina? His feelings are not to be described. The fond parent whose affection shoots even to a sense of pain feels not half such transport when he unexpectedly retrieves a darling child from the engulfing billows or devouring flame. The hope of Zelos had been totally extinguished. His heart had been incessantly torn with anguish and remorse, upbraiding him as the murderer of Seraphina. His, therefore, were the additional transports of a father disburdened of the guilt of such enormous homicide. His nerves were much overpowered by this sudden recognition to manifest the sensation of his soul by external signs. He started not, nor did he lift an hand in token of surprise. He moved not from the spot on which he stood, but riveting his eyes to those of the lovely wife phantom, remained without motion, until she, approaching with her lover, fell at his feet and clasping his knees exclaimed, "May I yet call you father?" This powerful shock aroused his faculties. A cold sweat bedewed his forehead. His knees began to totter. He dropped upon the floor and, throwing his arms around her, cried, "O nature, O Seraphina, merciful Providence, thy ways are past finding out." So saying, he fell upon her neck and wept aloud. The tears of sympathetic joy trickled down her snowy bosom that heaved with rapture inexpressible. Rinaldo's eyes poured forth the briny stream. The cheeks of Madame Clement were not dry in this conjuncture. She kneeled by Seraphina, kissed her with all the eagerness of maternal affection, and with uplifted hands adored the power at preordained this blessed event. The clergyman and doctor intimately shared the general transport. And as for Joshua, the drops of true benevolence flowed from his eyes like the oil on Aaron's beard, while he skipped about the room in an awkward ecstasy, and in a voice resembling the hoarse notes of the long-eared tribe, cried, "O Father Abraham! Such a moving scene hath not been acted since Joseph disclosed himself unto his brethren in Egypt." Don Diego, having found utterance to his passion, proceeded in this strain, "O my dear child, to find thee thus again after our last unhappy parting is wonderful, miraculous, blessed be the all-good my conscience. I am not then the dire assassin who sacrificed his wife and daughter to an infernal motive falsely titled honor, though I am more and more involved in a mystery which I long to hear explained." "That shall be my task," cried Rinaldo, "but first permit me to implore your sanction to my passion for the incomparable Seraphina. You already know our mutual sentiments, and though I own the possession of such inestimable worth and beauty would be a recompense that infinitely transcends the merit I can plead, yet, as it hath been my good fortune to inspire her with a mutual flame, I hope to reap from your indulgence here what I could not expect from my own desert, and we present ourselves in hope of your paternal assent and benediction." "Were she more fair and good and gentle than she is," answered the Castilian, "and to my partial observation not e'er appeared on earth more beauteous and engaging, I would approve your title to her heart, and recommend you to her smiles with all of her's influence and power. Yes, my daughter. My joy on this occasion is infinitely augmented by the knowledge of those tender ties of love that bind thee to this amiable youth, a youth to whose uncommon courage and generosity I owe my life and my subsistence, together with the inexpressible delight that now revels in my bosom. Enjoy, my children, the happy fruits of your reciprocal attachment. May heaven, which hath graciously conducted you through a labyrinth of perplexity and woe to this transporting VW of blissful days, indulge you with that uninterrupted stream of pure felicity, which is the hope and ought to be the boon of virtue such as yours." So saying, he joined their hands and embraced them with the most cordial love and satisfaction, which diffused itself to every individual of the company, who fervently invoked the Almighty Power in behalf of this enraptured. The tumult of these emat ions having a little subsided, and the Castilian being seated betwixt Rinaldo and his beauteous bride, He politely bespoke the indulgence of Madame Clement, begging she would permit him to demand the performance of the Count's promise, that he might be forthwith made acquainted with those circumstances of his own fate which he was so impatient to learn. The lady having assured him that she and all the company would take pleasure in hearing the recapitulation, the Spaniard, addressing himself to Melville in the name of heaven, said he, "How could you supplant that rival who fell a sacrifice to my resentment after he had bewitched the heart of Seraphina? For sure the affection he had kindled in her breast must have long survived his death." "That rival," replied the Count, "who incurred your displeasure was no other than Rinaldo." With these words he applied to one eye a patch of black silk provided for the purpose, and turning his face towards Don Diego, that gentleman started with astonishment, crying, "Good heaven! The very countenance of Orlando whom I slew, this is still more amazing." Chapter 65, a retrospective link necessary for the concatenation of these memoirs. "Indulge me with a patient hearing," proceeded the Hungarian, "and all these riddles soon will be explained. Inflamed with the desire of seeing foreign countries, I disobeyed the will of an indulgent father, from whose house, withdrawing privately, I set out for Italy in disguise by the way of Tyrol, visited Venice, Rome, Florence, and embarking at Naples in an English ship arrived at St. Lucar, from whence I repaired to Seville. There in a few days was my curiosity engaged by the fame of the fair Seraphina, who was justly deemed the most accomplished beauty in that part of Spain. Nay, blush not, gentle creature, for by my hopes of heaven, thy charms were even injured by the cold applause of that report. Nevertheless, I was warmly interested by the uncommon character, and eagerly longed to see this pattern of perfection. As Don Diego did not train her up in that restraint to which the Spanish ladies are subjected, I soon found an opportunity of seeing her at church. And no person here present will, I presume, doubt but that I was instantly captivated by her beauty and deportment. Had I thought that Don Diego's favor was unengaged, perhaps I should have followed the dictates of vanity and inexperience, and presented myself in my own character, among the crowd of her professed admirers. I knew her father had been an officer of distinguished rank and reputation, and did not doubt that he would have regarded a young soldier of unexceptionable pedigree, and I will even add of untainted fame. Nor did I suppose my own father could have objected against such an advantageous match, but by dint of industrious inquiry I learned that the divine Seraphina was already betrothed to Don Manuel de Mendoza, and this information overwhelmed me with despair. After having revolved 1,000 projects for retarding and preventing that detested union, I resolved to avail myself of my talent for drawing, and professed myself a master of that science, in hope of being employed by the father of Seraphina, who, I need let slip no opportunity of improving his daughter's education. Accordingly, I had the good fortune to attract his notice, was invited to his house, honored with his approbation, and furnished with unrestricted opportunities of conversing with the dear object of my love. The passion which her beauty had kindled was by the perfections of her mind inflamed to such a degree of transport as could not be concealed from her penetration. She chanced to relish my conversation. I gradually acquired her friendship. Pity was the next passion that she entertained in my favor. I then ventured to disclose myself, and the dear charmer did not disapprove of my presumption. She and her mother had been perplexed with some religious scruples concerning which they appealed to my opinion, and I was happy enough to set their minds at ease. This sort of intercourse naturally created a mutual confidence among us, and in a word, I was blessed with the daughter's love and mother's approbation. Don Diego will pardon these clandestine measures which we took, from a full persuasion that it was impossible to render him propitious to the views in which our hearts and hands were so deeply interested. I did not then know how little he was addicted to superstition. Without entering into a detail of the schemes we projected to delay the happiness of Mendoza, I shall only observe that, knowing the fatal day was at length unalterably fixed, we determined to elude the purpose of Don Diego by flight, and everything was actually prepared for our escape. When the hour of appointment arrived, I repaired to the place at which I had proposed to enter the house, and stumbled in the dark over the body of a man still warm and bleeding. Alarmed at this occurrence, I darted myself through the window, and rushing to the apartment of the lady's immortal powers, beheld the peerless Seraphina and her virtuous mother stretched on a couch and in all appearance deprived of life. The company will easily conceive what agonies I felt at such a spectacle. I ran towards the spot in a transport of horror. I clasped my lovely mistress in my arms, and finding her still breathing endeavored, but in vain, to wake her from the trance. Antonia was overwhelmed with the same lethargic power. My fancy was immediately struck with the apprehension of their being poisoned. Regardless of my own situation, I alarmed the family, called for assistance, and requested the servants to summon Don Diego to the dismal scene. I was informed that their master had rode forth in manifest confusion, and while I pondered on this surprising excursion, an apothecary in the neighborhood entered the chamber. and having examined the pulses of the ladies, declared thought their lives were in no danger, and advised that they should be undressed and conveyed to bed. While their women were busied in this employment, I went into the courtyard, attended by some of the servants with lights, in order to view the body of the man which I had found at my arrival. His apparel was mean, his countenance ferocious. A long spada was buckled to his thigh, and in his belt were stuck a brace of loaded pistols, so that we concluded he was some thief who had waited for an opportunity and seeing the casement open intended to rob the house, but was prevented and slain by Don Diego himself, whose retreat, however, did not a little confound our conjecture. For my own part, I remained all night in the house, tortured with fear, vexation, and suspense. My hope was altogether disappointed by this unhappy accident, and I shuddered at the prospect of losing Serafina forever, either by this mysterious malady or by her marriage with Mendoza, which I now despaired of being able to defeat. The major domo, having waited several hours for his lord's return without seeing him appear, thought proper to dispatch a messenger to Don Manuel with an account of what had happened, and that nobleman arriving in the morning took possession of the house. About 4:00 in the afternoon, Serafina began to stir, and at 5 she and her mother were perfectly awake. They no sooner recovered the use of reflection than they gave signs of equal sorrow and amazement, and earnestly called for Isabella, who was privy to our design, and who, after a very minute inquiry, was found in a lone and solitary chamber where she had been confined. Such was the confusion of the house, that no person ever dreamed of asking how I entered, each domestic in all probability, supposing I had been introduced by his fellow, so that I tarried unquestioned, on pretense of concern for the distress of a family in which I had been so generously entertained, and by Isabella sent my respects and duty to her ladies. She was therefore not a little surprised, when after every other servant had withdrawn she heard the lovely Serafina exclaim, "Why, all the violence of grief, ah, Isabella, Orlando is no more." But their astonishment was still greater when she assured them of my being alive and in the house. They recounted to her the adventure of last night, which she explained by informing them of the letters which Don Diego had intercepted. And they immediately concluded that he had in the precipitation of his wrath killed by mistake the person who was found dead in the courtyard. This conjecture alarmed them on my account. They by the idiom of Isabella conjured me to leave the house, lest Don Diego should return and accomplish his resentment, and I was persuaded to withdraw after I had settled the channel of a correspondence with the confidant. Being now obliged to alter our measures because our former intention was discovered by Don Diego, I secured a retreat for Serafina and her mother, at the house of the English consul in Seville, who was my particular friend. And next day, understanding from Isabella that her lord had not yet reappeared, and that Don Manuel was very urgent in his addresses, we concerted an assignation in the garden, and that same evening I was fortunate enough to convey my prize to the asylum I had prepared for their reception. Inexpressible was the rage of Mendoza when he heard of their elopement. He raved like one deprived of reason, swore he would put all the servants of the family to the rack, and in consequence of the intelligence he obtained by threats and promises, set on foot a very strict inquiry, in order to apprehend the fugitives and Orlando, who had by some means or other incurred his suspicion. We eluded his search by the vigilance and caution of our kind host, and while we remained in concealment, were extremely astonished to hear that the unfortunate Don Diego was proclaimed a traitor, and a price set upon his head. This information overwhelmed us all with the utmost affliction. Antonia lamented without ceasing the disgrace of her beloved lord, from whom she never would have withdrawn herself but with the lively hope of a reconciliation, after the first transports of his ire should have subsided and the real character of Orlando should have appeared. It was not long before we had reason to believe that Mendoza was the accuser of Don Diego, nay, start not Signor, Manuel was actually that traitor. This was the turn of his revenge. When he found himself disappointed in the hope of possessing the incomparable Serafina, he took a base advantage of your absence and retreat. He posted to Madrid, impeached you to the Secretary of State of having maintained a criminal correspondence with the enemies of Spain, included me in his accusation as a spy for the House of Austria, and framed such a plausible tale from the circumstances of your distress that Don Diego was outlawed, and Mendoza gratified with a grant of his estate. These melancholy incidents made a deep impression upon the mind of the virtuous Antonia, who, waiving every other consideration, would have personally appeared for the vindication of her husband's honor, had not we dissuaded her from such a rash undertaking by demonstrating her inability to contend with such a powerful antagonist, and representing that her appearance would be infallibly attended with the ruin of Serafina, who would certainly fall into the hands of the villain to whom she had been contract ed. We exhorted her to wait patiently for some happy revolution of fortune, and encouraged her with the hope of Don Diego's exerting himself effectually in his own defense. Meanwhile, our worthy landlord was suddenly cut off by death, and his widow being resolved to retire into her own country, we secretly embarked in the same ship, and arrived in England about 18 months ago. Antonia still continued to pine over the ruin of her house. As she could hear no tidings of Don Diego, she concluded he was dead, and mourned with unabating sorrow. In vain I assured her that soon as my own affairs should be adjusted, I would exert my whole endeavors to find and succor him. She could not imagine that a man of his spirit and disposition would live so long in obscurity. And her affliction derived new force from the death of the consul's widow, with whom she had lived in the most unbounded intimacy and friendship. From that day her health evidently declined. She foresaw her dissolution and comforted herself with the hope of seeing her husband and her friend in a place where no treachery is felt and no sorrow is known. Confident of my integrity and the purity of my love, she in most pathetic terms recommended Seraphina to my care. Weepest thou, fair excellence, at the remembrance of that tender scene, when the good Antonia on the bed of death joined thy soft hand to mine and said, "Rinaldo, I bequeath this orphan to your love. It is a sacred pledge which, if you cherish with due honor and regard, eternal peace and happiness will ever smile within your bosom. But if you treat it with indifference, dishonor, or neglect, just heaven will punish your breach of trust with everlasting disappointments and disquiet. Signor Don Diego, I see you are moved, and therefore will not dwell on such distressful circumstances. The excellent Antonia exchanged this life for a more happy state, and so exquisite was the sorrow of the tender-hearted Seraphina, as to torture me with the apprehension that she would not long survive her pious mother. How I obeyed the injunctions of that departing saint, Monimia, for that name she now assumed, can testify, until that artful serpent Fathom glided into our mutual confidence, abused our ERS, poisoned our unsuspected faith, and effected that fatal breach productive of all the misery and vexation which we have suffered, and which is now so happily expelled. Heaven, said the Castilian, hath visited me for the sins and errors of my youth, yet such mercy hath been mingled with its chastisements I dare not murmur or repine. The tears of penitence and sorrow shall water my Antonia's grave. As for Mendoza, I rejoice at his treachery, by which the obligation of my promise is cancelled and my honor fully acquitted. He shall not triumph in his guilt. My services, my character, and innocence shall soon confront his perfidy, and I hope defeat his interest. The king is just and gracious, nor is my family and name unknown. Here the Jew interposing, presented to him a letter from a person of consequence at Madrid, whom Joshua had interested in the cause of Don Diego. That nobleman had already found means to represent the case of Zelos to his majesty, who had actually ordered Don Manuel to be confined, until the injured person should appear to justify himself, and prosecute his accuser according to the terms of law. At the same time, Don Diego was summoned to present himself before the king within a limited time, to answer to the charge which Mendoza had brought against him. The Spaniard's heart overflowed with gratitude and joy when he read this intimation. He embraced the Jew who, before Zelos could give utterance to his thoughts, told him that the Spanish ambassador at London, having been prepossessed in his favor, craved the honor of seeing Don Diego, and that he, Joshua, was ready to conduct him to the house. Then is my heart at rest, cried the Castilian. The house of Zelos once more shall lift up its head. I shall again revisit my native country with honor, and abase the villain who hath sold my fame. O my children, this day is replete with such joy and satisfaction as I did not think had been in the power of heaven to grant without the interposition of a miracle. To you, Rinaldo, to you, illustrious lady, and to these worthy gentlemen, am I indebted for the restoration of that for which alone I wish to live. And when my heart ceases to retain the obligation, may I forfeit the name of a Castilian, and scorn and dishonor be my portion. Perhaps all Europe could not produce another company so happy as that which now sat down to dinner in the house of Madame Clement, whose own benevolent heart was peculiarly adapted for such enjoyment. The lovers feasted their eyes more than their appetite, by a tender intercourse of glances which needed not the slow interpretation of speech, while the Spaniard regarded them alternately with looks of wonder and paternal joy, and every individual surveyed the all-deserving pair with admiration and esteem. Seraphina, taking the advantage of this general satisfaction when the heart, softened into complacency, deposits every violent thought. I must now, said she, try my interest with Rinaldo. The good company shall bear witness to my triumph or repulse. I do not ask you to forgive, but to withhold your vengeance from the wretched Fathom. His fraud, ingratitude, and villainy are, I believe, unrivaled, yet his base designs have been defeated, and heaven perhaps hath made him the involuntary instrument for bringing our constancy and virtue to the test. Besides, his perfidy is already punished with the last degree of human misery and disgrace. The doctor who has traced him in all his conduct and vicissitudes of fortune will draw a picture of his present wretchedness, which I doubt not will move your compassion as it hath already excited mine. The generous hostess was ready to enforce this charitable proposal with all her eloquence, when Melville, with a look that well expressed his magnanimity of love, replied, "Such a boon becomes the gentle Seraphina. Every moment furnishes me with fresh matter to admire the virtues of thy soul. If thou, whose tender heart hath been so rent with misery and anguish, canst intercede for thy tormentor, who now suffers in his turn, shall I refuse to pardon the miserable wretch? No, let me glory in imitating the Gr. example, and solicit Don Diego in behalf of the same miscreant whose perfidious barbarity cost him such intolerable woe." "Enough," cried the Castilian, "I have disclaimed the vindictive principles of a Spaniard, and leave the miserable object to the esting of his own conscience, which, soon or late, will not fail to avenge the wrongs we have sustained from his deceit." Chapter 66. The history draws near a period. Universal was the applause which they acquired by this noble sacrifice of their resentment. The afternoon was spent in the utmost harmony and good humor, and at the earnest solicitation of Rinaldo, whose fancy still harbored the apprehensions of another separation, Don Diego consented that the indissoluble knot should be tied between that young gentleman and Seraphina in 2 days, and the place appointed for the ceremony was the very church where they had been restored to the arms of each other. The lovely bride, with a silent blush that set her lover's heart on fire, submitted to this determination, in consequence of which the company was bespoke for that auspicious hour, and the evening being pretty far advanced, they took leave of the ladies. A.N.D. retired to their respective homes, Don Diego and his future son-in-law being reconducted to their lodgings in the coach of the Jew, who, taking an opportunity of being alone with Melville, observed that it would be necessary on this occasion to supply The Castilian with a sum of money, in order to support his dignity and independence, in furnishing Seraphina with everything suitable to her rank and merit, and that he would willingly accommodate him, provided he knew how to propose it so as to give no offence to his punctilious disposition. Rinaldo, thanking him for this generous anticipation, advised him to solicit the Spaniard's correspondence in the way of business, and to put the whole on the footing of his own interest, by which means Don Diego's delicacy could sustain no affront. Fraught with this instruction, the Israelite desired a private audience of the Castilian, in which, after an apology for the freedom of his demand, "Signor Don Diego," said he, "as your fortune hath been so long embezzled by your adversary in Spain, and your correspondence with that country entirely cut off, it is not to be supposed that your finances are at present in such a condition as to maintain the splendor of your family. Count de Melville's whole fortune is at your command, and had not he been afraid of giving umbrage to the peculiar delicacy of your sentiments, he would have pressed you to use it for your convenience. For my own part, over and above the inclination I have to serve Don Diego, I consult my own private advantage in desiring you to accept my service on this occasion. Money is the chief commodity in which I deal, and if you honor me with your commands, I shall be a gainer by my obedience." Don Diego replied, with a smile that denoted how well he understood the meaning of this address, "Surely, Signor, I am bound by the strongest ties to exert my utmost endeavors for your advantage, and I pray God this your proposal may have that issue. I am well acquainted with the Count's generosity and refined notions of honor, and too much obliged by him already to hesitate with punctilious reserve in accepting his future assistance. Nevertheless, since you have contrived a scheme for removing all scruples of that sort, I shall execute it with pleasure, and in the form of business, you shall have all the security I can give for what shall be necessary to answer my present occasions." The preliminaries being thus settled, Joshua advanced for his use £1,000, for which he would take neither bond, note, nor receipt, desiring only that the Castilian would mark it in his own pocket-book, that the debt might appear, in case any accident should befall the borrower. Although the Spaniard had been accustomed to the uncommon generosity of Melville, he could not help wondering at this nobleness of behavior, so little to be expected from any merchant, much less from a Jewish broker. While this affair was on the anvil, Rinaldo, who could no longer withhold the communication of his happiness from his sister and relations in Germany, took up the pen, and, in a letter to his brother-in-law, recounted all the circumstances of the surprising turn of fate which he had experienced since his arrival in England. He likewise related the story of Don Diego, informed them of the day appointed for his nuptials, and entreated the Major to make a journey to London with his wife, or if that should be impracticable, to come as far as Brussels, where they should be met by him and his Seraphina. There was now but one day between him and the accomplishment of his dearest wish, and that was spent in procuring a license and adjusting the preparations for the grand festival. Don Diego in the forenoon visited Madame Clement, to whom he repeated his warm acknowledgments of her bounty and maternal affection to his daughter, and presented to Serafina banknotes to the amount of £500 to defray the necessary expense for her wedding ornaments. All the previous steps being taken for the solemnization of this interesting event, and the hour of appointment arrived, the bridegroom, accompanied by his father-in-law, hastened to the place of rendezvous, which was the vestry room of the church we have already described, where they were received by the good clergyman in his canonicals. And here they had not waited many minutes, when they were joined by Madame Clement and the amiable bride, escorted by the friendly physician who had all along borne such a share in their concerns. Serafina was dressed in a sack of white satin, and the ornaments of her head were adjusted in the Spanish fashion, which gave a peculiar air to her appearance, and an additional spirit to those attractions which engaged the heart of each beholder. There was nothing remarkable in the habit of Rinaldo, who had copied the plainness and elegance of his mistress, but when she entered the place, his features were animated with a double proportion of vivacity, and their eyes meeting seemed to kindle a blaze which diffused warmth and joy through the countenances of all present. After a short pause, her father led her to the altar, and gave her away to the transported Rinaldo before the priest who performed the ceremony and bestowed the nuptial benediction on this enraptured pair. The sanction of the church being thus obtained, they withdrew into the vestry, where Melville sealed his title on her rosy lips, and presented his wife to the company, who embraced her in their turns with fervent wishes for their mutual happiness. Though the scene of this transaction was remote from any inhabited neighborhood, the church was surrounded by a crowd of people, who, with uncommon demonstration of surprise and admiration, petitioned heaven to bless so fair a couple. Such indeed was our eagerness to see them, that some lives were endangered by the pressure of the crowd, which attended them with loud acclamations to the coach, after the bridegroom had deposited in the hands of the minister £100 for the benefit of the poor of that parish, and thrown several handfuls of money among the multitude. Serafina Ray embarked in Madame Clement's convenience, with that good lady and Don Diego, while Rinaldo with the clergyman and doctor followed in Joshua's coach to a pleasant country house upon the Thames at a distance of a few miles from London. This the Jew had borrowed from the owner for a few days, and there they were received by that honest Hebrew who had provided a very elegant entertainment for the occasion. He had also bespoke a small but excellent band of music, which regaled their ears while they sat at dinner, and the afternoon being calm and serene, he prevailed on them to take the air on the river, in a barge which he had prepared for the purpose. But notwithstanding this diversity of amusement, Rinaldo would have found it the longest day he had ever passed, had not his imagination been diverted by an incident which employed his attention during the remaining part of the evening. They had drunk tea and engaged in a party at whist, when they were surprised with a noise of contention from a public house that fronted the windows of the apartment in which they sat. Alarmed at this uproar, they forsook their cards and, throwing up the casement, beheld a hearse surrounded by 4 men on horseback, who had stopped the carriage and violently pulled the driver from his seat. This uncommon arrest had engaged the curiosity of the publican's family, who stood at the door to observe the consequence, when all of a sudden appeared a person in canonicals, well mounted, who, riding up to those who maltreated the driver, bestowed upon one of them such a blow with the butt end of his whip as laid him sprawling on the ground, and springing from his saddle upon the box, took the reins into his own hand, swearing with great vehemence that he would murder every man who should attempt to obstruct the hearse. The good priest who had married Rinaldo was not a little scandalized at this ferocious behavior in a clergyman, and could not help saying aloud, "He was a disgrace to the cloth," when the horseman, looking up to the window, replied, "Sir, may I be d—n'd if any man in England has a greater respect for the cloth than I have, but at present I am quite distracted." So saying, he whipped up the horses, and had actually disentangled the hearse from those who surrounded it, when he was opposed by another troop, one of whom alighted with great expedition, and cut the harness so as that he could not possibly proceed. Finding himself thus driven to bay, he leaped upon the ground, and exercised his weapon with such amazing strength and agility, that several of his antagonists were left motionless on the field, before he was overpowered and disarmed by dint of numbers, who assailed him on all sides. The mad parson being thus taken prisoner, an elderly person of a very prepossessing appearance went up to the hearse, and unbolting the door, a young lady sprung out and, shrieking, ran directly to the public house, to the infinite astonishment and affright of the whole family, who believed it was the spirit of the deceased person, whose body lay in the carriage. Rinaldo, who was with difficulty restrained from interposing in behalf of the clergyman against such odds, no sooner perceived this apparition than, supposing her to be some distressed damsel, his quixotism awoke. He descended in an instant and rushed into the house among those that pursued the fair phantom. Don Diego and the physician took the same road, while the real clergyman and Joshua taught our ride with the ladies, who were by this time very much interested in the event. Melville found the young lady in the hands of the old gentleman, who had released her from the hearse, and who now bitterly upbraided her for her folly and disobedience. While she protested with great vivacity that whatever she might suffer from his severate she would never submit to the hateful match he had proposed, nor break the promise she had already made to the gentleman who now attempted to rescue her from the tyranny of a cruel father. This declaration was followed by a plentiful shower of tears. Ick the father could not behold with unmoistened eyes, although he reviled her with marks of uncommon displeasure. And turning to the Count, "I appeal to you, sir," said he, "whether I have not reason to curse the undutiful obstinacy of that pert baggage, and renounce her for ever as an alien to my blood. She has for some months been solicited in marriage by an honest citizen, a £30,000 man, and instead of listening to such an advantageous proposal, she hath bestowed her heart upon a young fellow not worth a groat. Ah, you degenerate hussy, this comes of your plays and romances. If thy mother were not a woman of an unexceptionable life and conversation, I should verily believe thou art no child of mine. Run away with a beggar, for she—" "I suppose," replied Rinaldo, "the person to whom your daughter's affection inclines is that clergyman who exerted himself so manfully at the door." "Clergyman," cried the other, "adad, he has more of the devil than the church about him, a ruffian. He has, for aught I know, murdered the worthy gentleman whom I intended for my son-in-law, and the rogue, if I had not kept out of his way, would, I suppose, have served me with the same sauce. Me, who have been his master for many years, and had resolved to make a man of him. Sir, he was my own clerk, and this is the return I have met with from the serpent which I cherished in my bosom." Here he was interrupted by the arrival of the citizen for whom he had expressed such concern. That gentleman had received a contusion upon one eye, by which the sight was altogether obstructed, so that he concluded he should never retrieve the use of that organ, and with great clamor took all the spectators to witness the injury he had sustained. He entered the room with manifest perturbation, demanded satisfaction of the father, and peremptorily declared it should not be a lost eye to him if there was law in England. This unseasonable demand, and the boisterous manner in which it was made, did not at all suit the present humor of the old gentleman, who told him peevishly he owed him no eye, and bade him go and ask reparation of the person who had done him wrong. The young lady, snatching this favorable occasion, earnestly entreated Melville and his company to intercede with her father in behalf of her lover, who, she assured them, was a young gentleman of a good family and uncommon merit, and in compliance with her request they invited him and his daughter to the house in which they lodged, where they would be disencumbered of the crowd which this dispute had gathered together, and more at leisure to consult about the measures necessary to be taken. The old gentleman thanked them for their courtesy, which he did not think proper to refuse, and while he led, or rather hauled Mademoiselle over the way, under the auspices of the Castilian, Rinaldo set the lover at liberty, made him a tender of his good offices, and advised him to wait at the public house for an happy issue of their negotiation. The pseudo-parson was very much affected by this generous proffer, for which he made suitable acknowledgments, and protested before God he would die 1,000 deaths rather than part with his dear Charlotte. Her father no sooner entered the apartment, thought he was known by Joshua to be a considerable trader in the city of London, and the merchant was glad to find himself among his acquaintance. He was so full of the story which had brought him thither, that he had scarce sat down when he began to complain of his hard fate, in having an only child who was so mean, stubborn, and contumacious, and every sentence was concluded with an apostrophe of reproaches to the delinquent. The Jew, having allowed him to ring out his alarm, condoled his misfortune, and gravely counseled the young lady to wean her affections from such an unworthy object, for he supposed her favorite was a man of no principle or liberal endowments, otherwise her father would not exclaim so bitterly against her conduct. Charlotte, who wanted neither beauty nor understanding, assured him that her lover's character was in all respects unblemished, for the truth of which assertion she appealed to her papa, who owed with reluctance that the young man was a gentleman by birth, that he had served him with remarkable diligence and integrity, and that his accomplishments were far superior to his station in life. "But then," said he, "the fellow has not a shilling of his own, and would you have me give away my daughter to a beggar?" "God forbid," cried the Jew, "I always understood you possessed an ample fortune, and am sorry to find it otherwise." "Otherwise," cried the citizen with some acrimony. "Take care what you say, sir. A merchant's credit is not to be tampered with." "I beg your pardon," answered the Hebrew. "I concluded that your circumstances were bad, because you objected to the poverty of the young man after you had owned he was possessed of every other qualification to make your daughter happy. For it is not to be imagined, Ed, that you would thwart her inclinations, or seek to render an only child miserable on account of an obstacle which you yourself could easily remove. Let us suppose you can afford to give with your daughter £10,000, which would enable this young man to live with credit and reputation, and engage ye advantageously in trade, for which you say he is well qualified. The alternative then will be, whether you would rather see her in the arms of a deserving youth whom she loves, enjoying all the comforts of life with a moderate fortune, which it will always be in your own power to improve, or tied for life to a moneyed man whom she detests, cursing her hard fate and despising that superfluity of wealth, in spite of which she finds herself so truly wretched." The old gentleman seemed to be startled at this observation, which was reinforced by Rinaldo's saying that he would, moreover, enjoy the unutterable pleasure of giving happiness to a worthy man, whose gratitude would co-operate with his love in approving himself a dutiful son, as well as an affectionate husband. He then represented the family disquiets and dismal tragedies produced from such mercenary and compulsive matches, and in conclusion related the story of Don Diego and his daughter, which when the merchant heard, he started up with marks of terror in his countenance, and throwing up the casement, called upon Valentine with great vociferation. This was the name of his daughter's admirer, who no sooner heard the summons than he flew to the spot from whence it came, and the merchant, without any further preamble, seizing his hand, joined it with that of Charlotte, saying with great trepidation, "Here, take her in the name of God, and thank this honorable company for your good fortune." The lovers were transported with exquisite joy at this sudden determination in their favor. Valentine, having kissed the hand of his mistress with all the eagerness of rapture, and acknowledged the merchant's generosity, paid his respects to the ladies with a very polite address, and with demonstrations of uncommon gratitude and sensibility, thanked the gentleman, and the Count in particular, for their good offices, to which he attributed the happiness he now enjoyed. While Seraphina and Madame Clement Cares said the amiable Charlotte, the rest of the company congratulated her admirer upon his choice and success, though the clergyman could not help reprehending him for profaning the sacerdotal habit. Valentine hardly asked pardon for having given such cause of offense, and hoped he should be forgiven, as it was a disguise which he thought absolutely necessary for the execution of a scheme upon which his happiness depended. He then, at the request of Rinaldo, unfolded the mystery of the hearse, by giving them to understand that Charlotte's father, having got inkling of their mutual passion, had dismissed his clerk, and conveyed his daughter to a country house in the neighborhood of London in order to cut off their correspondence. Notwithstanding these precautions, they had found means to communicate with each other by letters, which were managed by a third person. And his rival being very importunate in his solicitations, they had concerted the expediency of the hearse, which he provided and conducted through a road contiguous to the end of the merchant's garden, where Charlotte, being apprised of the design, waited for its approach, and embarked in it without hesitation. Valentine thought himself sufficiently screened from discovery by his disguise, but he was unfortunately met by a servant of the family who recollected his features and immediately gave the alarm, upon which the father and his friends took horse and pursued them by 2 different roads until they were overtaken at this place. He had scarce finished this short relation, when his rival, bluntly entering the apartment with an handkerchief tied round his eye, committed Valentine to the charge of a constable, who attended him, by a warrant from a justice of the peace in that neighborhood, and threatened to prosecute the merchant on an action of damages for the loss of an eye, which he said he had sustained in his service. The company endeavored to appease this citizen, by representing that his misfortune was no other than a common inflammation, nor was it owing to malice aforethought, but entirely to the precipitate passion of an incensed young man, who, by the by, acted in his own defense. At the same time, the merchant promised to make any reasonable satisfaction, upon which the other demanded an obligation, importing that he would, in 10 days from the date, bestow upon him his daughter in marriage with a portion of £15,000, or, in case of failure, pay him double the sum. The merchant, exasperated at this extravagant demand, told him flatly he had already disposed of his daughter to Valentine, who, he believed, was a much more deserving man, and that he was ready to wait upon the magistrate who had granted the warrant, in order to give bail for his future son-in-law. This was a mortifying declaration to the plaintiff, though he condoled himself with the hope of being a gainer by the loss of his eye, and now the pain was over would have been very sorry to find his sight retrieved. The old gentleman, Joshua, and Ronaldo accompanied the prisoner to the house of the justice, where he was immediately admitted to bail. Upon their return, Valentine shifted his dress, and they supped together with great cordiality and mirth, maintaining at the expense of the discarded lover. After supper, Don Diego walked a minuet with Madame Clement, for whom, by this time, he had contracted an extraordinary degree of affection. Valentine had the honor to dance with the incomparable Seraphina, whose beauty and attractions dazzled the eyes of the newcomers and struck her bashful partner with awe and confusion. And Melville presented his hand to the agreeable Charlotte, who performed so much to the satisfaction of her father that he could not help expressing his joy and pride. He praised God for throwing him in the way of our company and engaged the clergyman to unite the young couple, after having appointed a day for the ceremony, and invited all present to the wedding. The evening having been insensibly consumed in these avocations, and the nig pretty far advanced, the ladies withdrew without ceremony, and the retreat of Seraphina filled Rinaldo's breast with tumult and emotion. His blood began to flow in impetuous tides, his heart to beat with redoubled vigor and velocity, while his eyes seemed to flash with more than human splendor. Now his imagination began to anticipate with the enthusiastic rage of an inspired Sibyl. He was instantaneously transported from the conversation, and every nerve was braced to such a degree of impatience that human nature could not long endure the tension. He therefore, having withstood the impulse about a quarter of an hour, at length gave way to his impetuosity, and springing from his friends found himself in a dark passage, at the farther end of which he perceived Madame Clement coming out of a chamber with a light, which at sight of him she set down and vanished in a moment. This was the star that pointed to his paradise. He hailed the signal, entered the apartment, and like a lion rushing on his prey approached the nuptial bed, where Seraphina, surrounded by all the graces of beauty, softness, sentiment, and truth, lay trembling as a victim at the altar, and strove to hide her blushes from his view. The door was shut, the light extinguished. He owned his lot was more than mortal man could claim. Here let me draw the decent veil that ought to shade the secret mysteries of Hymen. Away, unhallowed scoffers who profane with idle pleasantry or immodest hint these holy rites, and leave those happy lovers to enjoy in one another's arms unutterable bliss, the well-earned palm of virtue and of constancy, which had undergone the most severe refinement. A more deserving pair night's curtain shrouds not in its dark extent. The thoughts of Rinaldo's felicity threw a damp on the spirits of Valentine, who saw the term of his probation protracted a few days longer, and could not help wishing in his heart that he had achieved the adventure which would have abridged his expectatio and, though at the expense of the old gentleman's displeasure. He filled a bumper to the health of the bride and bridegroom, and throwing up his eyes with marks of admiration, exclaimed, "How happy is the Count! Alas! 5 days longer must I rein my impatience. It is but reasonable, you rogue, that your betters should have the start of you," said the merchant, who did him justice in the glass and counselled him to drown his impatience with good claret. The youth followed his advice, and it was late before the company retired to rest. These citizens, however, resolved to seize an opportunity of rallying the new married couple according to custom, and with that view arose early in the morning on the supposition of finding them still asleep. But they were not a little surprised when I entered the breakfasting room to see Rinaldo and his amiable bedfellow already dressed and awaiting to do the honors of the house. The old gentleman would fain have cracked a joke upon their extraordinary dispatch, but he was so much overawed by dignity and tamed by the sweetness of Seraphina's carriage that he durst not give utterance to his conception, and Valentine stood silent and abashed, as in the presence of a superior being. After breakfast, these gentlemen and Charlotte again expressed their sense of the obligations they owed to this happy family, repeated their invitation, and taking leave, returned to London in a coach that was provided overnight. Our friends being thus left to themselves, Don Diego turned towards Melville. "Now," said he, "that I have yielded to the impatience of your love as well as to the eagerness of my own desire to make you happy, I must beg leave to interrupt for a little while the stream of your mutual pleasure and propose a melancholy excursion, which, however, will not be wholly void of enjoyment. I have too long delayed the performance of my duty at Antonia's grave. Let us spend the forenoon in that pious pilgrimage. I will drop a few tears to the memory of that excellent woman, and never afterwards shall my friends be troubled with my grief." The proposal being universally approved, they set out for the place, which had oft been visited by the gentle Seraphina, who conducted her father to a black marble stone which Rinaldo had ordered to be laid over the grave. And as he kneeled to kiss the monument, he perceived this plain inscription in the Spanish tongue: "Antonia de Zelos primer and Tudulo quaes ser buono," y sin segundo en todo lo que fu ser destachado quedad con Dios. That is, Antonia de Zelos, unmatched in virtue and unequaled in misfortune, adieu, O faithful record, cried the Castilian, smiting his breast while his tears distilled upon the marble. Thy goodness was the gift of heaven, but thy misfortunes were derived from the guilt of Don Diego, yet his sorrow shall expiate his offense, and his penitence find favor in the sight of heaven. Rest, rest, ill-fated virtue. Eternal peace shall guard thy tomb, and angels minister to thy unspotted shade, nor shall thine ashes lie in dark obscurity. Here will I raise a monument, more suited to thy excellence and name. Serafina melted with filial tenderness, nor were the rest unmoved at this affecting scene, which Don Diego did not quit without reluctance. Chapter 67, The Longest and the Last. The nature of this visit had softened every heart and saddened every countenance, and they walked in solemn silence to the other side of the churchyard in order to regain their carriages. When at the turning of the stile they saw a young woman, in reached attire, running out of a poor habitation, wringing her hands in all the agony of despair. Notwithstanding the distraction in her countenance, and the meanness of her apparel, she discovered a regularity of features, and a delicacy of air, which did not at all correspond with the misery of her equipage. These exhibitions of extreme distress soon attracted the notice and compassion of our company, and Melville's beauteous helpmate, accosting this forlorn damsel with a pity-breathing aspect, asked the cause of her disorder. Alas! Dear lady, cried the other with all the emphasis of woe, an unhappy gentleman now breathes his last within this inhospitable hovel, amidst such excess of misery as would melt the most flinty bosom. What then must I feel who am connected with him by the strongest ties of love and conjugal affection? Who is the unfortunate object? Said the physician. He was once well known in the gay world, replied the young woman. His name is Fathom. Every individual of the company started at mention of the detested name. Serafina began to tremble with emotion, and Rinaldo, after a short pause, declared he would go in, not with a view to exult over his misery, but in order to contemplate the catastrophe of such a wicked life, that the moral might be the more deeply engraved on his remembrance. The young countess, whose tender heart could not bear the shock of such a spectacle, retired to the coach with Madame Clement and the Jew, while Rinaldo, accompanied by the rest, entered a dismal apartment altogether void of furniture and convenience, where they beheld the wretched hero of these memoirs stretched almost naked upon straw, insensible, convulsed, and seemingly in the grasp of death. He was worn to the bone either by famine or distemper. His face was overshadowed with hair and filth. His eyes were sunk, glazed, and distorted, his nostrils dilated, his lips covered with a black slough, and his complexion faded into a pale clay color tending to a yellow hue. In a word, the extremity of indigence, squalor, and distress could not be more feelingly represented. While Melville perused this melancholy lesson and groaning, cried, "Behold the fate of man." He perceived a letter in the right hand of the unfortunate Fathom, which lay fast clenched across his breast. Curious to know the contents of this paper, which the young woman said he had kept in that position for several days, he drew nearer the wretched couch, and was not a little surprised to see it addressed to the Right Honourable Rinaldo Count de Melville, to the care of Mr. Joshua Manasseh, merchant in London. When he attempted to disengage this billet from the author's hand, the sorrowing female fell upon her knees, entreating him to desist, and telling him she had promised upon oath to communicate the contents to no person upon earth, but to carry the letter upon her husband's decease to the gentleman to whose care it was directed. Rinaldo assured her upon his honor that he was the very Rinaldo Count de Melville for whom it was intended, and the young creature was so much confounded at this information that before she could recollect herself, Melville had opened the billet and read these words: "If this paper should fall into the hands of the noble Rinaldo, he will understand that Fathom was the most execrable traitor that ever imposed upon unsuspecting benevolence or attempted to betray a generous benefactor. His whole life was a series of fraud, perfidy, and the most abominable ingratitude. But of all the crimes that lay heavy upon his soul, his being accessory to the death of the incomparable Serafina, whose father he had also robbed, was that for which he despaired of heaven's forgiveness, notwithstanding the dreadful compunction and remorse which have long preyed upon his heart, together with the incredible misery and deplorable death which by this time he hath undergone. Though these sufferings and sorrows cannot atone for his enormous guilt, perhaps they will excite the compassion of the humane Count de Melville. At least, this confession, which my conscience dictates under all the terrors of death and futurity, may be a warning for him to avoid henceforth a smiling villain, like the execrable Fathom, upon whose miserable soul Almighty God have mercy." Rinaldo was deeply affected with the contents of this scroll, which denoted such horror and despair. He saw there could be no dissimulation or sinister design in this profession of penitence. He beheld the condition of the writer, which put all his humane passions in commotion. so that he remembered nothing of Fathom but his present distress. He could scarce maintain those indications which might have been justly deemed the effect of weakness and infirmity, and having desired the physician and clergyman to contribute their assistance for the benefit of that wretch's soul and body, he ran to the coach and communicated the letter to the ladies, at the same time drawing a picture of the object he had seen, which brought tears into the eyes of the gentle Seraphina, who earnestly entreated her lord to use his endeavors for the relief and recovery of the unhappy man, that he might, if possible, live to enjoy the benefit of mature repentance, and not die in that dreadful despair which he manifested in the letter. Rinaldo, returning to the house, found the pious clergyman reading prayers with great fervency, while Don Diego stood with his right hand upon his breast, looking steadfastly upon the agonizing Fathom, and the young woman kneeled with her streaming eyes lifted up to heaven in an ecstasy of grief and devotion. The physician had run to an apothecary's shop in the neighborhood, from whence he soon returned with an assistant, who applied a large blister to the back of the miserable patient, while the female, by the doctor's direction, moistened his mouth with a cordial which he had prescribed. These charitable steps being taken, Count de Melville entreated the apothecary's servant to procure a tent, bed for the accommodation of the sick person with all imaginable dispatch, and in less than an hour one was actually pitched, and Fathom lifted into it after he had been shifted, and in some measure purified from the dregs of his indigence. During this transaction the ladies were conducted to a tavern not far off, where dinner was bespoke, that they might be at hand to see the effect of their charity, which was not confined to what we have already described, but extended so far that in a little time the apartment was comfortably furnished, and the young creature provided with change of apparel and money to procure the necessaries of subsistence. Notwithstanding all their care, the wretched Fathom still remained insensible, and the doctor pronounced a very unfavorable prognostic, while he ordered a pair of additional vesicatories to be laid upon his arms and other proper medicines to be administered. After dinner the ladies ventured to visit the place, and when Seraphina crossed the threshold the weeping female fell at her feet and kissing her robe exclaimed, "Sure you are an angel from heaven." The alteration in her dress had made a very agreeable change in her appearance, so that the Countess could now look upon her without shuddering at her distress, and as Fathom was not in a condition to be disturbed, she took this opportunity of inquiring by what steps that unfortunate wretch was conveyed from the prison, in which she knew he had been confined, to the place where he now lay in such extremity, and by what occurrence he had found a wife in such an abyss of misfortune. Here the other's tears began to flow afresh. "I am ashamed," said she, "to reveal my own folly, yet I dare not refuse a satisfaction of this kind to a person who has laid me under such signal obligations." She then proceeded to relate her story, by which it appeared she was no other than the fair and unhappy Eleanor, whom the artful Fathom had debauched upon his first arrival in town, in the manner already described in these memoirs. "Heaven," continued she, "was pleased to restore the use of my reason, which I had lost when I found myself abandoned by the Count. But all my connection with my own family being entirely cut off, and every door shut against a poor creature who could procure no recommendation, except the certificate signed by the physician of Bedlam, which instead of introducing me to service was an insurmountable objection to my character, I found myself destitute of all means of subsisting, unless I would condescend to live the infamous and wretched life of a courtesan, an expedient rendered palatable by the terrors of want. Cooperating with the reflection of the irretrievable loss I had already sustained, I ask pardon for offending your chaste ears with this impure confession of my guilt, which heaven knows, I then did, and now do look upon with abhorrence and detestation. I had already forfeited my innocence, and wanted resolution to encounter misery and death. Nevertheless, before I could determine to embrace the condition of a prostitute, I was one day accosted in the park by an elderly gentleman who sat down by me upon a bench, and taking notice of the despondence which was evident in my countenance, pressed me to make him acquainted with the nature of my misfortune. So much sympathy and good sense appeared in his deportment and conversation that I gratified his request, and he, in return for my confidence, saved me from the most horrible part of my prospect, by taking me into his protection and reserving me for his own appetite. In this situation I lived a whole year, until I was deprived of my keeper by an apoplectic fit, and turned out of doors by high-s relations, who did not, however, strip me of the clothes and movables which I owed to his bounty. Far from being as yet reconciled to a vicious life, I resolved to renounce the paths of shame, and converting my effects into ready money hired a small hop, and furnished it with haberdashery ware, intending to earn an honest livelihood by the sale of these commodities, together with the plain work in which I hoped to be employed so soon as my talents should be known. But this scheme did not answer my expectation. The goods spoiled upon my hands, and as I was a stranger in the neighborhood, nobody would entrust me with any other business. So that, notwithstanding the most parsimonious economy, I ran in debt to my landlord, who seized my effects, and an Osier from whom I had received some parcels upon credit took out a writ against me, by virtue of which I was arrested and imprisoned in the Marshalsea, where I found my first seducer. Good heaven! What did I feel at this unexpected meeting, overwhelmed as I was before with my own distress? I with a loud scream fainted away, and when I recovered, found myself in the arms of Mr. Fathom, who wept over me with great affliction. All his prospects of gaiety had now vanished, and his heart was softened by his own misfortunes to a feeling of another's woe, as well as to a due sense of his own guilt. He expressed the deepest sorrow for having been the occasion of my ruin, endeavored to comfort me with a promise of assistance, and indeed, by practicing medicine among the prisoners, made shift to keep us both from starving. But surely no sinner underwent such severe remorse as that which he suffered during his imprisonment. From the day of our meeting, I never once saw him smile. A melancholy cloud continually overhung his countenance. He numbered the minutes by his groans. He used to start with horror from his sleep, and striking his breast would exclaim, "O Eleanor, I am the worst of villains." Sometimes he seemed disordered in his brain and raved about Rinaldo and Monimia. In a word, his mind was in a dreadful situation, and all his agonies were communicated to me, whom by this time he had married in order to make some atonement for my wrongs. Wretched as he then was, I remembered the accomplished youth who had captivated my virgin heart. The old impressions still remained. I saw his penitence, pitied his misfortune, and his wife being dead, consented to join his fate, the ceremony having been performed by a fellow prisoner who was in orders. Though his hard-hearted creditor had no other chance of being paid than that of setting him at liberty, he lent a deaf ear to all our supplications. And this cruelty, conspiring with the anguish of my husband's own reflection, affected his health and spirits to such a degree that he could no longer earn the miserable pittance which had hitherto supported our lives. Then our calamities began to multiply. Indigence and famine stared us in the face, and it was with the utmost difficulty that we resisted their attacks, by selling or pledging our wearing apparel, until we were left almost quite naked, when we found ourselves discharged by an act passed for the relief of insolvent debtors. This charitable law, which was intended for a consolation to the wretched, proved to us the most severe disaster, for we were turned out into the streets, utterly destitute of food, raiment, and lodging, at a time when Mr. Fathom was so weakened by his distemper that he could not stand alone. I supported him from door to door, imploring the compassion of charitable Christians, and was at length permitted to shelter him in this miserable place where his disease gaining ground. He lay 3 days in that deplorable condition from which he hath now been rescued, though I fear too late, by your humanity and benevolence. She shed a flood of tears at the conclusion of this mournful tale, which did not fail to affect the whole audience, especially Seraphina, who assured her that, whatever should happen to her husband, she might depend upon finding favor and protection, provided her conduct should correspond with her professions. While this grateful creature kissed the hand of her kind benefactress, Fathom uttered a groan, began to stir in the bed, and with a languid voice called upon Eleanor, who, instantly withdrawing the coupe-artane, presented the whole company to his view. He had now retrieved the use of his perception by the operation of the blisters, which began to torture him severely. He looked around him with amazement and affright, and distinguishing the 3 persons against whom the chief arrows of his fraud and treachery had been leveled, he concluded that he was now arrived at the land of departed souls, and that the shades of those whom he had so grievously injured were come to see him tormented according to his deem writs. Fraught with this notion, which was confirmed by the bodily pain which he felt, and the appearance of the clergyman and Joshua, whom he mistook for the ministers of vengeance, he cried in a tone replete with horror, "Is there no mercy then for penitence? I ask there no pity due to the miseries I suffered upon earth? Save me, O bountiful heaven, from the terrors of everlasting woe. Hide me from these dreadful executioners whose looks are torture. Forgive me, generous Castilian, O Rinaldo. Thou hadst once a tender heart. I dare not lift my eyes to Seraphina, that pattern of human excellence, who fell a victim to my atrocious guilt, yet her aspect is all mildness and compassion. How are not these the drops of pity? Yes, they are the tears of mercy. They fall like refreshing showers upon my drooping soul. Ah, murdered innocence, wilt thou not intercede for thy betrayer at the throne of grace?" Here he was interrupted by Melville, who with a grave and solemn air pronounced, "Great hath been thy guilt, unhappy Ferdinand, and great have been thy sufferings. Yet we come not to insult, but to alleviate thy distress. Providence hath kindly defeated thy dire intentions, which we therefore now forgive and transmit to oblivion, whether it be thy lot to yield up thy spirit immediately, or to survive the dangerous malady with which thou art at present overwhelmed. Suffer not thyself to despair, for the mercy of heaven is infinite, and submit to the directions of this worthy gentleman who will employ his skill for thy recovery, while we shall take care to furnish thee with necessary attendance. As too much speaking may be prejudicial to thy health, I dispense with thy reply and exhort thee to compose thyself to rest. So saying, he drew the curtain, and the company retired, leaving Fathom entranced with wonder. The next step which Rinaldo took for the benefit of this wretched penitent was to send for the apothecary, with whom he left a sum of money to be expended for the convenience of Fathom and his wife. Then he laid injunctions upon the physician to repeat high visits, and that gentleman, together with the clergyman and Joshua, taking leave of the others till next day, the Count set out with the ladies and his father-in-law to the house where they had lodged the preceding night. The reader may well imagine the conversation of the evening turned wholly upon the strange occurrence of the day, which seemed to have been concerted by supernatural prescience, in order to satisfy the vengeance, and afford matter of triumph to the generosity of those who had been so grievously injured by the guilty Fathom. Though not one of them would say that such a miscreant ought to live, yet all concurred in approving the offices of humanity which had been performed, and even endeavored to find specious pretext for vindicating their compassion. Don Diego said, it would ill become a transgressor like him to withhold his forgiveness from a sinner who had wronged him. Madame Clement appealed to the approbation of heaven, which had undoubtedly directed them that way, for the purpose they had fulfilled. Seraphina observed that the crimes of the delinquent were obliterated by his sorrow, misery, and repentance. Rinaldo honestly owned that, exclusive of other reasons, he could not deny himself the luxurious enjoyment of communicating happiness to his fellow creatures in distress, and each fervently prayed that their charity might not be disappointed by the death of the object. While they amused themselves in these discussions, Fathom, after having lain some hours silent, in consequence of Rinaldo's advice, could no longer suppress the astonishment of his mind, but addressing himself to his wife, "O Eleanor," said he, "my delirium is now past, though I still remember the fantasies of my distempered brain. Among other reveries, my imagination was regaled with a vision so perfect and distinct as to emulate truth and reality. Methought Count de Melville, Don Diego de Zelos, and the divine Seraphina, the very persons who are now crying before the throne of heaven for vengeance against the guilty Fathom, stood by my bedside with looks of pity and forgiveness, and that Rinaldo spoke peace to my despairing soul. I heard the words distinct lie. I retain them in my memory. I saw the tears trickle from Seraphina's eyes. I heard her father utter a compassionate sigh, and should actually believe that they were personally present, had not I long ago seen with my own eyes the funeral procession of that young lady, whose wrongs God pardon, and were I not convinced that such a meeting could not be effected without the immediate and miraculous interposition of heaven. Yet everything I now see corresponds with the words of Rinaldo, which still sound in my ears. When my perception forsook me, I lay in the most abject misery among straw, and thou, poor injured innocence, wast naked and forlorn. Now I find myself reposed in a warm, easy, comfortable bed. I see around me the marks of human charity and care, and the favorable change in thy appearance glads my poor dejected heart. Say, whence this happy alteration? Do I really awake from that dream of misery in which we have continued so long? Or do I still utter the extravagant ravings of a distempered brain? Eleanor was afraid of imparting at once all the particulars of the happy change he had undergone, lest they might leave a dangerous impression upon his fancy, which was not yet duly composed. She contented herself, therefore, with telling him that he had been obliged to the humanity of a gentleman and lady, who chanced to pass that way by accident, and who, understanding his deplorable case, had furnished him with the conveniences which he now enjoyed. She then presented to him what the doctor had directed her to administer, and admonishing him to commit his head to the pillow, he was favored with a breathing sweat, fell fast asleep, and in a few hours waked again altogether cool and undisturbed. It was upon this occasion that his wife explained the circumstances of that visit which had redeemed him from extremity of wretchedness and the jaws of death, upon which he started up and throwing himself upon his knees exclaimed, "All gracious power, as was the work of thy own bounteous hand, the voice of my sorrow and repentance hath been heard. Thou hast inspired my benefactors with more than mortal goodness in my behalf. How shall I praise thy name? How shall I requite their generosity? Oh, I am bankrupt to both. Yet let me not perish until I shall have convinced them of my reformation, and seen them enjoying that felicity which ought to be reserved for such consummate virtue." Next day in the forenoon he was visited by the physician, whom he now recollected to have seen at the house of Madame Clement, and after having thanked that gentleman for his humanity and care, he earnestly begged to know by what means Seraphina had been preserved. When he was satisfied in this particular, and given to understand that she was now happy in the arms of Rinaldo, blessed be God, he cried, for having defeated the villainy of him who sought to part such lovers, "Dear sir, will you add 1 circu to your charity and bear to that happy couple and the noble Don Diego the respects and the remorse of a sincere penitent, whom their compassion hath raised to life? I have been such a traitor to them that my words deserve no regard. I will not therefore use professions. I dare not hope to be admitted into their presence. I am indeed ashamed to see the light of the sun. How then could I bear the looks of that injured family? Ah, no, let me hide myself in some obscure retreat where I may work out my salvation with fear and trembling and pray incessantly to heaven for their prosperity." The physician promised to represent his contrition to the Count and his lady, and accordingly proceeded to their habitation, where he repeated these expressions and pronounced his patient out of danger, so that their thoughts were now employed in concerting a scheme for his future subsistence, that he might not be exposed by indigence to a relapse in point of morals. Rinaldo being still averse to any personal intercourse with such a wretch, until he should give some undoubted proofs of amendment, and as Wyatt afraid of entrusting him with any office that required integrity, resolved, with the approbation of all present, to settle him in a cheap county in the north of England, where he and his wife could live comfortably on an annuity of £60, until H's behavior should entitle him to a better provision. This resolution was just taken, when Joshua arrived with a gentleman whom he introduced to Don Diego as the secretary of the Spanish ambassador. After the first compliments, the stranger told the Castilian that he waited upon him at the desire of his Excellency, who would have come in person had he not been confined by the gout. Then he put into his hand a letter from the court of Madrid, written by a nobleman of Diego's acquaintance, who informed him that Don Manuel de Mendoza, having made away with himself by poison in order to avoid the disgrace of a legal conviction, His Catholic Majesty was now convinced of Don Diego's innocence, and granted him leave to return and take possession of his honors and estate. This information was confirmed by the secretary, who assured him that the ambassador had orders to make him acquainted with this favorable decision of the king. The Castilian, having first acquitted himself in the most polite terms to the secretary, and the Jew, who, he said, had always been a messenger of glad tidings, communicated his happiness to the company, and this evening concluded the third day of their rejoicing. Next morning Don Diego went to visit the ambassador, accompanied by Joshua and the secretary, while the physician, repairing to the habitation of Fathom, signified by Rinaldo's direction the resolution which had been taken in his behalf. And the patient no sooner heard his doom than, lifting up his hands, he cried, "I am unworthy of such tenderness and benevolence." While Eleanor shed a flood of tears in silence, unable to give utterance to her grateful thought, Melville's bounty having so far transcended her most sanguine hope. The Spaniard, having paid his devoirs to his Excellency, returned before dinner, and in the afternoon, desiring a private conference with Seraphina, they retired into another apartment, and he expressed himself to this effect: "You have contracted, my dear child, an habit of calling Madame Clement your mother, and doubtless by her maternal tenderness and regard she hath acquired a just title to the appellation. Yet I own I would fain strengthen it by a legal claim. I no sooner retrieved my daughter than I gave her away to the most deserving youth that ever sighed with love. I rejoice in the gift which secured your happiness, but I left myself in a solitary situation, which even the return of my good fortune cannot render easy and supportable. When I revisit the castle of Zelos, every well-known object will recall the memory of my Antonia, and I shall want a companion to fill her place, and to sympathize with me in that sorrow which will be derived from my remembrance. Who is there so worthy to succeed your mother in the affection of Don Diego, as she who interests her love for Seraphina, and resembles her so strongly in every virtue of the sex? Similar attractions will produce similar effects. My heart is already attached to that good lady, and provided Seraphina shall approve of my choice, I will lay myself and fortune at her feet." The fair countess replied with an enchanting smile that before this declaration she had with pleasure perceived the progress which Madame Clement had made in his heart, and that she did not believe there was a person upon earth better qualified to repay the loss he had sustained, though she foresaw one obstacle to his happiness, which she was afraid would not be easily surmounted. "You mean," answered the Castilian, "the difference of religion, which I am resolved to remove by adopting the Protestant faith, though I am fully satisfied that real goodness is of no particular persuasion, and that salvation cannot depend upon belief, over which the will has no influence." I invest you, therefore, with the charge of declaring my passion and proposal, and empower you to satisfy her scruples with regard to the religion which I now profess, and which I shall not openly relinquish, until I shall have secured in this country effects sufficient to screen me from the ill consequences of my king's displeasure. Seraphina undertook this office with pleasure, because she had reason to think his addresses would not be disagreeable to Madame Clement, and that same night made the Count acquainted with the nature of her commission. Nor was her expectation disappointed. The French lady, with that frankness which is peculiar to virtue and good breeding, confessed that Don Diego was not indifferent to her choice, and did not hesitate in receiving him upon the footing of a lover. As we have already dwelt circumstantially on the passion of love, so as perhaps even to have tired our readers, we shall not repeat the dialogue that passed, when the Spaniard was indulged with an opportunity to explain his sentiments. Suffice it to observe that the lady's days of coquetry were now over, and that she was too wise to trifle with the time, which every moment became more and more precious. It was agreed then that Don Diego should settle his affairs in Spain, and return to England in order to espouse Madame Clement, with a view to fix his residence in this island, where Rinaldo likewise proposed to enjoy the sweets of his fortune, provided he could draw hither his interests and connections. Meanwhile, having for some days enjoyed his bliss with all the fullness of rapture amidst this small but agreeable society, he shifted the scene, and conducted his dear partner to a ready-furnished house in town, which, together with an occasional equipage, his friend Joshua had hired for the accommodation of him and his father-in-law, who, during his stay in England, failed not to cultivate the mistress of his heart with the most punctual assiduity. Hitherto Seraphina had been as a precious jewel locked up in a casket, which the owner alone had an opportunity to contemplate. But now the Count, who was proud of such a prize, resolved to let her shine forth to the admiration of the whole world. With this view he bespoke such ornaments as befitted her quality, while the mantua makers were employed in her service, made a tour among his former acquaintance, and discharged the obligations under which he lay to some who had assisted him in his distress. He did not, however, introduce them to his charming Seraphine, because not one of them had formerly treated her with that delicacy of regard which he thought her due, and some of them were much mortified at their neglect, when they saw what a dazzling figure she made in the beau monde. She was visited by the Spanish and imperial ambassadors, and divers other foreigners of distinction, to whom Melville had letters of recommendation. But her first public appearance was in a box at the opera, accompanied by Madame Clement, the Count, and Don Diego. The entertainment was already begun, so that her entrance had the greater effect upon the audience, whose attention was soon detached from the performance and riveted upon this amiable apparition, which seemed to be some bright being of another world dropped from the clouds among them. Then did the spirit of curiosity play its part. 1,000 whispers circulated, as many glasses were exalted to reconnoiter this box of foreigners, for such they concluded them to be from their appearance. Every male spectator acknowledged Seraphina to be the paragon of beauty, and every female confessed that Melville was the model of a fine gentleman. The charms of the young countess did not escape the eye and approbation of royalty itself, and when her rank was known, from the information of the ambassadors and other people of condition who were seen saluting her at a distance, that same evening 1,000 bumpers were swallowed in honor of the Countess de Melville. The fame of her beauty was immediately extended over this immense metropolis, and different schemes were concerted for bringing her into life. These, however, she resisted with unwearied obstinacy. Her happiness centered in Rinaldo and the cultivation of a few friends within the shade of domestic quiet. She did not even forget the concerns of the wretched Fathom and his faithful Eleanor, who daily enjoyed fresh instances of her humanity and care. When his fever forsook him, he was supplied with nourishing food for the recovery of his health, and as soon as he found himself in a condition to travel, he gave notice to his benefactor, who desired Joshua to settle with him the manner in which he was to receive his allowance, and to pay the first half-year's salary per advance. This affair being adjusted, and the place of his retreat signified, the Jew told Eleanor that she might wait upon the Countess before their departure, and she did not fail to make use of this permission. After they had made the necessary preparations for air journey and taken places in the York stagecoach, Mrs. Fathom, clothing herself in decent apparel, went to the house of Count Melville and was immediately admitted to the presence of Seraphina, who received her with her usual complacency, enriched her with salutary advice, comforted her with the hope of better things, provided her conduct and that of her husband should henceforth be found irreproachable, and wishing her peace and happiness, presented her with a box of linen and 20 guineas in a purse. Such excessive goodness overpowered this sensible young woman to such a degree that she stood before her in speechless awe and veneration. And the Countess, in order to relieve her from the confusion under which she suffered, quitted the room, leaving her to the care of her woman. It was not long, however, before her gratitude broke out in loud exclamations and a violent passion of tears, which all her efforts could not for a while overcome. By this time the coach was brought up to the gate for the reception of Serafina, who took an airing every day at the same hour. When Rinaldo, leading her to the vehicle, beheld a man plainly dressed standing within the court, with his head and body bent towards the earth, so that his countenance could not be purse-eyed. Melville, who supposed him to be some unfortunate man come to implore his charity, turned towards him and asked with a humane accent if he wanted to speak with any person in the house. To this interrogation the stranger replied without lifting up his head, "Overwhelmed as I am with Count Melville's generosity, together with a consciousness of my own unworthiness, it ill becomes a wretch like me to importune him for further favor. Yet I could not bear the thought of withdrawing, perhaps forever, from the essence of my benefactor, without soliciting his permission to see his face in mercy, to acknowledge my atrocious crimes, to hear my pardon confirmed by his voice and that of his accomplished countess, whom I dare not even at a distance behold, and to express my fervent wish for their prosperity." Melville, whose heart was but too tender, could not hear this address without emotion. He recognized the companion of his infancy and youth. He remembered the happy scenes he had enjoyed with Fathom, whose voice had always such an effect upon his ear as to excite the ideas of friendship and esteem, and he was disturbed by this unexpected meeting, which also discomposed the beauteous Serafina. Rinaldo having paused a little, "It is with pain," said he, "I recollect anything to the prejudice of Fathom, whose future behavior will, I hope, erase the memory of his offenses and justify what other steps I may take in his favor. Meanwhile I heartily forgive what is past, and in token of my sincerity present my hand," which our adventurer bathed with his tears. The Countess, whose mind was in unison with her husband, repeated her assurances of pardon and protection, at which the penitent rejoiced in silence, while he raised his head and took a parting view of those charms which had formerly enslaved his heart. Having thus obeyed the dictates of his duty and inclination, he next morning embarked in the stagecoach with his faithful Eleanor, and in 6 days arrived at the place of his retreat, which he found extremely well adapted to the circumstances of his mind and fortune. For all his vice and ambition was now quite mortified within him, and his whole attention engrossed in atoning for his former crimes by a sober and penitent life, by which alone he could deserve the uncommon generosity of his patrons. While he thus accommodated himself to his new system, Rinaldo received letters of congratulation from his sister, who with the major had come to Brussels in order to meet her brother and Serafina, according to his proposal. This intimation being communicated to Don Diego, he resolved to accompany them to Flanders on his way to Spain. Preparations were made for their departure. The clergyman and physician were honored with valuable marks of friendship and esteem from the Countess, Rinaldo, and the Castellan, who were convoyed to Deal by Madame Clement, to whom at parting Don Diego presented a diamond ring, as a pledge of his inviolable love. Here the travelers hired a vessel for Ostend, which they reached in a few hours. In 2 days more they arrived at Brussels, where Mrs. Farrell and her husband were struck with admiration at the surprising beauty and accomplishment of their sister-in-law, whom they caressed with equal tenderness and joy. In a word, all parties were as happy as good fortune could make them, and Don Diego set out for Spain after they had agreed to reside in the Low Countries till his return. The end.